Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how you find your way around a new city or even your own home? Well, this new paper dives deep into something called cognitive maps, and it turns out they might not be what we always thought. So what exactly is a cognitive map? For a long time, scientists thought we build these pretty solid, detailed mental pictures of our environment, like a treasure map in our head. This would let us plan routes, take shortcuts, and generally navigate without always looking at signs. Think of it like having a complete blueprint of the world around you stored in your brain. This ability to move from point A to point B is super important, and scientists have been trying to figure out the mental tools we use for it. The idea of a cognitive map, first proposed by folks like Edward Tolman, was that we have more than just simple stimulus response learning. It wasn't just about turning left at the door because you've done it before, but understanding the whole layout. Later, O'Keefe and Nadel really fleshed out this idea, suggesting our brains create a unified, almost geometric model of space. They thought once you pinpoint one location, the whole map is essentially fixed. This is a really strong idea that we have the stable, internally consistent map. Then there is Gallistel, who thought of it as a representation of relative positions. He also brought up an interesting distinction between a true map and field notes. This idea of field notes is key. It suggests that maybe our long-term spatial knowledge isn't one big perfect map, but more like a collection of pieces of information. The big debate is about what kind of representation this is. Is it a perfectly accurate, detailed map or something else? The paper talks about three main ideas: a very precise Euclidean coherent map, a less precise but still coherent map, and then a more fragmented map. So imagine a really accurate map, A, a map that is mostly good but maybe a bit distorted in places, B, or just a bunch of disconnected notes about landmarks, and how to get between a few specific points, C. The researchers here looked at mountains of studies to see which of these ideas best explains how we navigate. They talk about classic experiments like those with rats. Tolman showed that rats could take shortcuts they hadn't directly traveled before. This seemed to prove they had a map, because how else could they figure out the new, shorter route? But here is where it gets interesting. The authors point out that even these classic experiments might have simpler explanations. For example, maybe the rats weren't using a whole map, but just a strong landmark like a light to guide them, a strategy called beaconing. This means the shortcut didn't necessarily require a full map, leading to what they call a failure of task, meaning the task didn't actually prove what it was thought to prove. They also discuss the famous Morris Water maze, where rats swim to find a hidden platform. This also seemed to require a map, but again, the researchers suggest it might be explained by simpler directional cues, or that in difficult versions of the task, the animals failed, which they call a failure of navigation. They looked at human studies too, using things like virtual reality environments and pointing tasks. While humans often did better than chance, their performance was often error-prone and showed weird biases. For example, people would sometimes point way off target, or their estimates of distance would be skewed by how many turns a route had, which doesn't quite fit with a perfect stable map. They found that people would often estimate junctions as 90 degrees even if they weren't, and had bigger errors when pointing between routes that were learned separately. This suggests our mental spatial representations might not be as precise or as globally consistent as a true map. The paper questions whether these so-called advantages of having a cognitive map, like taking novel routes or navigating in the dark, are truly only solvable with a coherent map. They argue that simpler strategies, often combined, can explain a lot of this flexible navigation, even when planning a new route or changing direction mid-journey. The errors observed suggest we're not relying on a perfectly precise map. So, if lab experiments are equivocal, what about real life? They consider navigating a city. Imagine you need to go from shop A to shop B, and you've never been directly between them. A coherent map would be great, but you might also just use a tall building as a landmark to get you in the right general direction. Or, you might know a route to shop A from your house, and another route to shop B from your house, and then you cleverly stitch those together. This involves combining pieces of learned information, not necessarily accessing one giant map. This leads to a really important part of the paper, navigational strategies. They argue that how we navigate the strategies we choose actually shapes the mental representations we form. It is not like we have a map and then choose a strategy to use it. Instead, the strategy itself helps build the mental representation we need in that moment. They talk about simple response strategies, like turning left here versus place strategies, which involve understanding relationships between locations. But they go beyond that to include things like beaconing using a landmark, route following linking known paths, and piloting, navigating towards a non-visible landmark. Piloting, for instance, where you head towards a landmark you can't see, sounds like it would need a detailed map. but the paper argues it can often be done by learning specific directions from known starting points, again by linking pieces of information rather than consulting a whole map. And then there are navigational aids, things like GPS or even just road signs. These tools significantly change how we navigate and what kind of mental representations we need. The paper suggests these aids aren't just tacked onto an existing cognitive map, they actively shape the representations we form. The paper also delves into the neuroscience, looking at brain areas like the hippocampus, which is heavily involved in memory and spatial processing. They discuss place cells neurons that fire when an animal is in a specific location. They mention other types of spatially tuned neurons like head direction cells and border cells that give different kinds of spatial information. And then there are grid cells, which seem to provide a kind of spatial metric, helping with distance. However, even these neurons are more flexible than a static map would suggest. Place cells can remap change their firing patterns, not just when the environment changes physically, but even when something non-spatial like a smell or color changes. This suggests they're very sensitive to the current context. Even more strikingly, some evidence suggests hippocampal neurons are tied to action plans, not just abstract locations. This challenges the idea of a pure detached map. The paper points out that the same location can be represented differently depending on which route you are taking to get there, and even grid cells can warp their patterns based on the shape of the environment. This all points away from a rigid, fixed map. So, what's the alternative? The authors propose that long-term spatial knowledge is stored in a much more fragmented way, like those field notes Gallistel mentioned. These are like bits and pieces of information. But here is the crucial part. When we need to navigate, we dynamically reconstruct more complex representations in the moment. It is like pulling out those relevant field notes and stitching them together to solve the specific problem at hand. This is a really key idea, reconstruction. Think of it like how episodic memory works. You don't perfectly replay a past event. You reconstruct it using cues and your current understanding. Similarly, they argue we reconstruct our spatial understanding as we navigate. They show this visually in Figure 2. You have your fragmented knowledge A, and then depending on what you are doing, you might use a simple strategy like beaconing to a landmark B, combine two known routes C, or even stitch together multiple fragments to create a temporarily coherent representation to navigate a complex novel route. The critical point is that this representation is built for that moment. So instead of a fixed cognitive map, they propose dynamic, reconstructed cognitive maps. These aren't just about space. They can also incorporate non-spatial information like, that street is usually busy at this time, or I saw my annoying neighbor near that shop yesterday, so I'll avoid it. They call this a cognitive collage. This idea of a cognitive collage is really powerful. It means our mental representation is built from whatever information is most useful right now, which can be a mix of spatial details, past experiences, social cues, and even sensory information like hearing a river before seeing it. What does this mean for future research? The authors push for studying navigation in more complex, real-world settings, not just simplified lab environments. They want us to use better technology to track movement and eye gaze, and to combine this with methods like interviews to understand the strategies people are actually using. They suggest looking at how strategies change over time, and how different environmental features influence those choices. For humans, they advocate for studying navigation in real-world environments, not just virtual ones, and even using wearable technology to track movement. In conclusion, this paper makes a compelling argument that our cognitive maps aren't static blueprints. Instead, they are dynamic, flexible, and constructed on the fly, piecing together fragments of knowledge with strategies and aids to meet the immediate demands of navigating our complex world. It is a fascinating shift from thinking about a fixed internal map to a fluid interactive process. What do you think about this idea of dynamically reconstructed cognitive maps? Does it resonate with how you navigate? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science insights, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the human mind. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.